Ed, thank you very much for joining us for the FTP, Data Transfer and Use Agreement Template 101 webinar, and hopefully all of the information you need for a successful kickoff of the D2A template pilot starting November 1st. My name is Melissa Korf. I'm the Associate Director for Grants and Contracts at Harvard Medical School. And my co-presenter today is Martha Davis, Associate Director at Brandeis University. We're going to start with a little bit of an overview of the templates for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to use them before. But before that, we'll dive into a little bit of the background that led to the template development, some of the work that we did to create the templates, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the details of the pilot. We'll discuss the overall goals of the pilot, what we're calling the rules, or what we're asking pilot participants to do, the timeline, and then, of course, we'll answer any questions that you may have about the templates or the pilot or DTUAs generally. We will pause briefly in between the sort of two general sections. So after we go over the templates, we'll pause and see if there's questions on specifically that content. Then we'll go into the pilot content, and then similarly at the end, have an opportunity for a question and answer on that section. So what is a DTUA anyway? What are we talking about? So broadly speaking, it's a contractual agreement used to define how exchanged data may be accessed and or used. There's a lot of different labels that we see attached to these. Data use agreement, which is what folks might be a little bit more accustomed to seeing, a non-disclosure agreement, a confidentiality agreement, a memorandum of understanding, an information transfer agreement. These are all labels that are attached to an agreement whereby an investigator is receiving a data set or information that they intend to use in a research project. And we intend to capture all of those when we say data transfer and use agreement. And you all might be thinking, well, data use agreement is a more common term. That's how people refer to them, you know, most of the time. So why are we calling this a DTUA? Why not just a DUA? And under HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, under HIPAA, a DUA, or a data use agreement, is specifically defined as that agreement that you use to transfer a limited data set for research. And we wanted the template that we were creating for it to be clear that the intention was for it to be usable for a broad range of data types. And so we chose data transfer and use agreement so as to be clear that it wasn't just an agreement for a limited data set. And we thought that it was a pretty accurate description of what we're doing. We're setting out an agreement that governs the transfer and use of research data. So what is research data anyway? It's recorded factual material. It isn't actual material. It isn't cells. It isn't lab notebooks. It's the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. And in surveys and discussions with FDP member organizations, we found that the volume and complexity of DTUAs is really going through the roof lately. I've heard from a number of colleague institutions who've said, you know, we went to having almost none to having like, you know, 100 in a year. We've seen a 300% increase in our data transfer and use agreements. And, you know, I know at my own institution, I see, you know, 20 to 30% increase annually in our volume. And when each one is different, you have to read each one and you have to negotiate the terms, and you have to communicate differently with a faculty member so that they know where to find the terms that are relevant to them, and you know, make sure they know where to look so that they know what they need to do to comply with a data transfer and use agreement. in addition to that, we have a lot of faculty now in the era of big data that are combining different data sets for a research project. They might be getting a data set from a collaborator at institution A, and then from an insurance company, and maybe from an NIH repository, and combining them all together. And when those DUAs all have widely varying terms, it becomes very difficult for that faculty member to understand what they need to do for compliance with that whole data set. So we embarked on the effort to create a data transfer and use agreement template as a first step towards improving the quality of those agreements. So sometimes we also see a one-page agreement that doesn't actually cover all of our obligations in using a data set, and creating greater consistency in terms and format to reduce associated administrative burden. We are hoping that the DTUA will have a very similar effect as something like the UBMTA, the Universal Biological Material Transfer Agreement, has had for MTAs, or that the FDP subaward agreement template has had for subaward agreements, where really driving towards some consistency in the format and terms has greatly improved turnaround time and, reduced negotiation effort and time associated with those agreement types. And even outside of FGP member institutions, we can see that some of those templates, even when they're not adopted in their entirety, that they're there and they provide some sort of model for consistent language, actually helps us get better language or start to see better language from other folks who aren't using the whole template but are borrowing pieces. And those of you who pay attention to the latest breaking news on data sharing like I do will have seen that NIH published their RFI for information that will help them in the final stages of development of the NIH-wide data sharing policy. So we see the agencies encouraging and creating more policies. NIH is just the latest in the large federal funders, not to mention the foundation funders that are developing data sharing requirements. So the requirement to share the data is there, which means that there's more data out there to be shared, more data that our faculty are needing, and a low burden method for sharing that data that we can't just post on a website is going to be really critical in helping us comply with those obligations. When there's more data, there's more DUAs, and if we're having to negotiate each one of those separately and review on each separately and develop different compliance methods for widely different terms, it will really make that harder on our faculty and harder on ourselves. So hopefully this template will be that first step towards creating a low burden method for that and actually help remove one of the potential roadblocks to data sharing. So when we were embarking on creating the template, we opted to go after sort of the low-hanging fruit initially. The simplest paradigms for data sharing are, you have a provider institution who has a data set, and you have a recipient institution who would like to access that data set for use in a project at their own institution. So it's a single directional flow of information from the provider institution to the recipient institution. It assumes no collaboration between the two entities. It doesn't really contemplate bidirectional flow of information. We wanted to start with this simple paradigm so that we could try to make sure that we were getting things right, and then try to roll out potentially different face pages that might help accommodate these other kinds of scenarios. Or as some of you may have heard, working with a subawards group to develop a specific attachment that could be incorporated into a subaward agreement that would cover these terms. But for right now, it's just we're going for the simplest scenarios. And in that same vein, we have created attachments that work for de-identified data about human subjects or a limited data set. Or, of course, if you are sharing a data set that doesn't require, by regulation or law, additional requirements beyond what would be the standard terms in any data transfer and use agreement, then you can use the face page without any additional special terms in an attachment 2. So for the pilot purposes, and because quite honestly it's what we've published so far, those are the data types that would be covered right now by published documents and under the pilot. So like I said, the template currently isn't designed for bidirectional flow of information, though I've heard from some institutions that were able to easily make a few tweaks and have it work for that. It isn't designed for sharing of materials. So if you're sharing data and human cells or human tissue samples or something like that, it doesn't really contemplate the sharing of physical materials. Doesn't really work for a repository where one entity has collected data from a broad number of institutions, or where third-party rights that are inconsistent with the template terms attached to the data set. So if you've obtained the data from a colleague institution, and you made maybe some modifications to it, and then you want to share, or you added your own data to it, and you want to share the full data set with a third collaborator, where you have terms and obligations to the original data provider, the DTUA template in its current form would require some tweaks potentially to work in that scenario. So what are we talking about when we talk about de-identified data about human subjects or a limited data set? So if we're talking about a covered entity under HIPAA, in that case, we would be looking for all 18 of the identifiers enumerated under HIPAA to be removed from the data set. And if the provider is not a covered entity, we would look for identifying information such as name or social security number that would enable anyone with access to the data set to readily re-identify the subjects to have been removed. So, de-identified from a common role or an IRB perspective. When we're talking about a limited data set, it's a very specific definition under HIPAA, and basically all but 2 of those 18 identifiers have to be removed in order for something to be considered a limited data set. And we'll get into how to handle the limited data set from a covered entity to a non-covered entity, or those kinds of questions in a little bit. So the template structure, when we were working on creating the template, we talked about a few different options, and because we were trying to create something for data that was very similar to what the UBMTA did for MTAs, we considered that model where there is an overarching agreement, master agreement, that institutions have signed on to, and then as each sample is shared or as each material is shared, there's an implementing letter that's executed for that specific transfer. But we realized that when we're talking about data, it requires a little bit more flexibility in the terms, because based on the flavor or the type of data that's being shared, you need, by law or regulation, you need some slightly different terms. You need some slightly different terms for de-identified data versus a limited data set versus, PHI, full PHI, and we wanted to create something that would be flexible enough to accommodate that. And so we looked to the FDP subaward agreement format in that it provides the flexibility to be issuing subawards that are at their core very similar, but under, awards from a varying set of agencies that require flow down of slightly different terms. And looking at that model, we created a face page, which is actually several pages, but for sake of consistency, a face page that includes the information and terms that we feel needed to be included in every data and transfer and use agreement, regardless of the data type. And then an attachment 1 that includes information related to the project specifics, the description of the data, the description of the project that you're obtaining the data for, or you're sharing the data for, are there any kind of specific transfer requirements that both parties need to be aware of? And in regards to attachment 1, I've actually heard from some institutions that faculty actually find that to be a really useful tool as they're planning for sharing of certain data, like, oh, I should think about those things. I should think about how I'm going to actually get you this data set while we're planning for this transfer. So it can actually be a very nice tool in helping faculty plan their data sharing scenarios. Attachment 2 is where you would incorporate any additional terms that are required by law or regulation. So that's where you would see the couple additional terms that are usually added in when you're dealing with de-identified data or a limited data set or other types of data. And attachment 3, there's a lot of data providers that might want each individual institution who's going to access the data to sign their own separate data use agreement. And some institutions would say, nah, man, I want to only share this with one institution, and you take responsibility for whoever else needs to access it for your project, and you take responsibility for getting them access to that data and the liability for them accessing the data through you. And so we wanted to provide enough flexibility for both providers, where if a provider wanted to allow access by third-party collaborators at other institutions and the recipient institution, they could indicate that on attachment 3. So you can either say none on attachment 3 or provide a definition of who you're authorizing. So where can I find these template documents, Melissa? They're all available off of both the Data Stewardship and Contracts Subcommittee pages on the FDP website. Well, I guess one of the things that I didn't mention when we were talking about the background is that this is a collaborative effort between the Data Stewardship Subcommittee under the Research Compliance Committee and the Contract Subcommittee under the Research Administration Committee, because it really kind of covers both aspects. There's an agreement aspect, and there's an aspect of ensuring appropriate data stewardship and security of the data that's being shared. The components that are currently available are a single PDF document that includes the face page components as well as attachments 1 and 3, because those are the attachments, those are the documents that are going to be consistent regardless of which type of data you're sharing. And unfortunately, we're just not to the place where we have enough consistency in the language to consider doing some of the really fancy programming that the subawards group has done. So we have to have the versions of attachment 2 be separate PDF documents for right now. It is a thing that we're hoping to maybe get to, where we could do some of the programming that you could just click a little radio button and have it pull in the right attachment 2 terms. But for right now, we're a little lower tech, and there is a separate PDF document of the attachment 2 for de-identified data about human subjects, a separate PDF document for DTUA for attachment 2 for limited data set, and a separate PDF document for other. And I can talk a little bit more about what we envision the other attachment to be used for in a few minutes. And so one quick point on this is I believe that it's one of the pitfalls that folks have seen with folks who have already started using the templates is that a version of attachment 2 must be incorporated in the final agreement package. So even if you're comfortable totally with all of the face page terms, you don't feel that you need to add additional terms for the type of data that you're sharing, you do need to include attachment 2 other and mark none, because otherwise it looks like maybe a document just got left out or something along those lines. So just an important reminder that some version of attachment 2 should be incorporated in every full agreement package. As I mentioned, they are PDF documents, and they're form fillable in places where we feel that people would need to be adding additional information. Especially in attachment 1, where there's large text boxes for things like a description of the data or a description of the project, we have included instructions to the drafter with the type of information that the working group felt one should consider when completing this section. And then we do ask that language that's not, where a text box isn't provided for special language to be included, that the form not be modified. The whole point, as with the subaward agreement templates, is to create some consistency and thereby get some reduction in administrative burden and some streamlining. And so where the text is not intended to be altered, we ask that it not be. So if the technological gods are with me today, I am going to pull up the PDF documents. Here, give me 1 second. So while I have this screen up, I also did just want to show what the data stewardship page looks like. And so this is where all of the documents right here are available via the website. And on the contracts website, it looks very much the same. All of the documents are just posted in a format like this. Underneath the templates, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these documents in a few minutes, are some of the guidance documents that we've developed already. And of course, the FAQ documents that we've circulated for the pilot.
Melissa, I'm not sure. This is Martha. I'm not seeing that, but maybe it's just my screen. I don't know if other folks are seeing that.
This is Anne. I'm not seeing it as well. Do you mind going back to the slides and resharing your screen and seeing if that pulls it up?
Sure, let me see here. Oh, no. How's that?
Yeah.
Better. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see that now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can you see the data stewardship page now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So sorry about that. So now you can see where we have the documents posted and in the same format on the contracts website, and then there are the guidance documents below that, and then below that documents related to the pilot, which right now is just the FAQs, but as we get closer to launch, additional documents might be posted there. Okay. And now we can all see the face page, hopefully. So you can see that this is the May 2017 version. That is when the templates were originally posted on the website. So some of you may have already started using this template, or you may have seen an agreement come in on this template from another institution that has already started using it. Please feel free, if you want to use it before the pilot kicks off, or you want to suggest it to your friends who are FTP member institutions, this is out there for anyone who would like to use it. We have included a little text box here for an agreement ID. Some institutions, my own is just launching use of the Huron Agreements module, so some institutions may use a system that will assign an agreement ID. And so if you have one, you can put that here. And it's helpful because we are have several pages that constitute the full agreement. It might be helpful just to make sure that you've got all the right pages in the right document. And then provider and recipient. So provider we define as the entity that is sharing the data set, and the recipient is the entity that is receiving it. This terminology is mirrored off the terminology that's in the UBMTA template. As we tried to, we mirrored the FTP subaward template, but where we could also incorporate some consistency of terms in the UBMTA, we tried to do that as well. And then rather than having a separate attachment for contact information, as there is in the subaward agreement, we felt that there was really few enough contacts that were needed for the data transfer and use agreement that we put boxes right under the name of the institution for the provider scientist's name and email, or the recipient scientist's name and email. And I've heard from some institutions that have said, well, you know, what if we don't really have a PI that's in charge of the data set that we're sharing? And I would say whoever then is really the programmatic contact for that data set would be the appropriate person to list there. We have a place here for a project title, which we construe as the title of the project that the recipient will be performing with the data set. And a box for agreement term. And these are text boxes, so you can change them. But we have pre-typed in the start date, date of last signature below. In the working group's experience, most institutions are not willing to share a data set with a recipient until that data transfer and use agreement is executed. So it seemed to make the most sense that the earliest possible start date would be the date of last signature. And then we provided for the end date to be an amount of time after the start date for that reason. Usually you need the data for, well, my project is going to take 3 years, so you need the data for that 3 years whenever it gets signed. But that is also a text box and so editable. But we typed in 3 because that seemed like a pretty average length of time for data use agreements. And then the final box in that header is a drop-down menu for attachment to type. And that's where you would select which data type and which attachment to type the reviewer can anticipate to see when they get to that point of the document. There is an option here for fully identifiable human data, though that attachment to version is not yet published. So for right now, with published components, it would really just be the de-identified data about human subjects, limited data set, or the other C attachment to options. So like I said, these terms and conditions here are what we felt as a working group would be needed for any agreement that is being executed for sharing of research data. So here in Article 1, provider is going to provide the data to the recipient and a reinforcement that the provider retains full ownership rights in the data set. And in Section 2, we've introduced the concept that it's possible that the provider will incur some costs in preparation or transfer of the data set. If, for example, it's a very large data set and the best way to transfer the data is to purchase a server or an external hard drive, download the data and ship that to the recipient, the cost of perhaps purchasing the external storage or the shipping costs may be the types of costs that the provider would seek reimbursement for. A reminder in Article 3 that the recipient won't use the data except as set forth under the agreement. And then the remainder of Section 3 is where we get into the definition of authorized persons. And so if someone is, or if a provider is going to permit collaborator personnel, this is where we see that concept introduced into who's actually authorized to use the data. In Section 4, we cover that the recipient is obligated to retain control over the data and put in place appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to prevent any unauthorized use or access to the data. And in general, comply with whatever additional requirements are set forth in that attachment 2 that gives those sort of data-specific type terms. A general compliance with law statement in Article 5 that we will generally use the data in a way that complies with applicable laws. And then a publication section in Article 6. We had a lot of conversations about this because it seemed that including the 30-day review period maybe shouldn't be necessary, and so should we encourage institutions not to include that? But at the end of the day, we've seen, some inconsistency in this section and wanted to put out there language that is broadly acceptable to most institutions. So rather than leaving it out and have a lot of institutions feel that they couldn't use the template because this wasn't addressed, or try to insert something that wouldn't be consistent with what's usually expected by academic institutions, we felt that it was wise to insert something here. So we cover permission to publish and then a 30-day review period for the provider in which to identify if any section of the data has been inadvertently included. So on the second page here too, we see that the agreement ID would carry through. So on the first page, if you insert it there, it just carries through the rest of the documents in this PDF document. 7, we agreed to recognize the contribution of the provider, and if there is a specific publication or other citation that should be used for the data set, that can be included in attachment 1. Here in 8, we cover termination provisions, and that attachment 1 may provide further information on disposition of the data upon termination. 9 is a pretty standard disclaimer of warranties, and in 9 and 10 is where we really tried to maintain some consistency with the UBMTA, because a lot of institutions might prefer to have an indemnification in a data use agreement to ensure that the provider is taking on the liability for their use of the data. But a lot of our member institutions are also signatories to the UBMTA, and so that middle ground space of not an indemnification, but the recipient, taking on responsibility for their actions with the data seemed to be a good middle ground, or we hoped would be a good middle ground. In Article 11, we have some pretty standard use of name language that we tried to have consistent with the use of name language that's been inserted in the subaward agreement, the FDP subaward agreement. And in Section 12, because we're all lawyerly legal agreement types, we actually enumerated the attachments that constitute the full agreement. And then on the final page of what we call the face page, we have the signatory blocks. So this is where we have some language that reinforces that if you are going to sign this data transfer and use agreement, you should be authorized to do so by your institution. Because I hope I'm not alone in the fact that sometimes faculty might think that they are authorized to sign, and in some cases their institutions will authorize them to sign agreements like this. But we wanted to just remind people to make sure that they are in fact authorized to sign before they do so. And then there's also underneath the signature block for each party to the agreement, there's a place for contact information for formal notices. So up at the very top of the document, the start of the document is where we would include programmatic contacts. And then the very end here underneath the signature blocks is where we would provide administrative contacts. Moving on into attachment 1. So this is where you see that we have these big text boxes for things like description of the data and have instructions to the drafter. So this is very important, that second part of that first statement, to delete after completion of this section. So the text that's in here is really just to give some prompts as to the level of detail that would be appropriate for these sections or the types of information that a faculty member might want to include here. So in the description of the data, a description of the population of human subjects that the data has been obtained from if it's related to human subjects. If it's from animal subjects, perhaps the species or the number of animals that were included. The name of the study that the data was obtained under. And, as I mentioned when we were going over the face page, if there is a particular publication or a grant that needs to be acknowledged in publications that result from use of the data, this is a place that that information could be provided to the recipient. Section 2 of Attachment 1, the description of the project. So we view this as very similar to a statement of work in a subaward agreement. It should be sufficient for both parties to understand the project that the recipient will be undertaking, and if required by your institution or by regulation, should be sufficient for an IRB to understand how the data will be used and determine whether or not it's consistent with consent if the data is about human subjects. So we suggest the objective or the purpose of the work, a general description of the actions to be performed by the recipient with the data. And then in particular, if there's any restrictions on linkage of the data with other data sets, that information could be included here. Or if your faculty member knows that they need permission to link it with another data set, they might want to include that here so it's clear that they are going to do that. In Section 3, you can provide, if there is a different contact for someone who should be receiving the data when it's transferred. So in some of our departments here at HMS, we'll have faculty who have a programmer that helps them out. And that's the person who should receive the data set because they're going to make sure it goes where it needs to go and get it ready for the research project. So they could put that name here and give some indication as to any special instructions that might be needed by either party in order to make the transfer. And in section 4, in the face page, it addresses that if there's any need to reimburse costs, it'd be addressed in this section. So in a lot of cases, it'll probably be none. In many cases, if we're able to just make a secure file transfer of a research data file, that's low or no cost in some cases, and so this will be none. But if perhaps there are some costs and you know that the way that you need to handle that is by a separate purchase order or something along those lines, that could be, you could indicate that in the second box, or if you have just a few instructions, like it's going to cost me $100 to ship you back your external hard drive, you could indicate that in the third box, and then there's a text box for that information. Disposition requirements. We had a lot of conversations about DUAs that say at the end of this DUA or DTUA, you'll either return or destroy the data, based on however we instruct you to do it. And a feeling that to the extent possible, it would be really nice to know ahead of time if you're expected to destroy the data or return it, just so that you can make sure that you're storing the data in a way that's appropriate for whichever method. So if there's special instructions that you'd like to provide for that, that can be included in Article 5 on Attachment 1. And then here we see Attachment 3, which you can either indicate that collaborator personnel means none, so no third-party collaborators are permitted to access the data set through this agreement, or you can check the second box and mutually agree on who that might be. So you can either, we've provided a suggested definition for collaborator personnel here. It might work better for certain parties to actually list individuals. If there's going to be some agreement on collaborator personnel, this is really intended to be flexible to meet your needs. And then we can take a look at some of the attachments. So I've just brought up the attachment 2 for de-identified data about human subjects. Martha, do you see that one, just to make sure?
I do.
Okay, good. So like I said, it's very important to make sure that, oh, excuse me, hold on one second. It's very important to make sure that a version of attachment 2 is incorporated. Oh, excuse me. And we think that probably the most commonly used attachments will be either this one, which is de-identified data about human subjects, which covers in the first 2 bullets basically the definition that you're, as a provider, you're saying you'll either not include any personally identifiable information, or if you're a covered entity, that you will have de-identified the data to the HIPAA standard. And then some of the standard things we see with the de-identified data set, that the recipient won't attempt to re-identify the subjects, they won't attempt to notify or be in touch with the subjects. And also that the provider, if there is a key, the provider won't provide it to the recipient. And that will promptly disclose any inappropriate or unauthorized uses of the data. The probably most common second type of data set that we see data transfer and use agreements for is a limited data set. And this is, we very carefully went through the HIPAA regulations and checked off the boxes. So either the element that's required in a data use agreement under HIPAA is included in the face pages, or if not, it's included in this attachment too. We also opted in section 4 of this attachment to actually list the identifiers that have to be removed, because a lot of participants in the working group had found that some investigators would say, oh, no, this is de-identified. And then they'd look at the description of the data and say, but I see you need this information. What do you mean this is de-identified or this is a limited data set? And so by providing the identifiers that have to be removed, we thought, in this attachment, we thought that would help streamline review because the reviewer would have it right there. And also as a reference point for faculty members who are trying to determine which data type they have. And then otherwise, this attachment is very similar to the de-identified in the sense that the recipient won't attempt to re-identify the subject, will comply with any local regulations relating to IRB approval, and insertion of HIPAA references, or potentially the need to amend the DTUA if HIPAA is amended down the road. And then we see the other version of attachment 2. So here, this very first box, none. If you are sharing a data set that you really only need the terms that are in the face page, make sure that you include this version of attachment 2 and check none, so that someone doesn't think, the other party doesn't think that you've just forgotten to include the appropriate version of attachment 2. Or if there are some minor additional terms and conditions that need to be incorporated in order to comply with a state law. So we've heard about a relatively recent law in California that might deal with data privacy. And so if a California institution is sharing data and just needs to insert reference to that California law, they might be able to use this attachment. But we ask that the attachment to other not be used as a way to get around or modify the core terms of the data transfer and use agreement by adding a whole bunch of additional terms that aren't required by some sort of law or regulation. So I think that covers the templates. So I'll pause for a second and see if anyone has questions on that section of the webinar.
So
Melissa,
I'll say that.
Sorry.
I'm not seeing any questions, but there are a couple of questions that people have asked previously.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them being, I think you've covered a lot of them. When would a non-covered entity component disclose a HIPAA limited data set?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I did cover that. So thank you for that, Martha.
Okay.
And we are working on creating a set of FAQs that will cover some of these kinds of questions. But the answer is they wouldn't. We wouldn't expect that a non-covered entity or a non-covered component of a hybrid entity would have occasion to be sharing a limited data set because it's only meaningful under HIPAA for covered entities. We have heard of some institutions that where they are a non-covered entity, but the data set includes some dates, like might be in a limited data set, that perhaps they might be inclined to want to insert some additional terms, but the limited data set attachment 2 wouldn't be appropriate for that. Kind of the flip side question to that is, can a non-covered entity receive a limited data set? And yes, they can. The determination whether or not something is a limited data set is based on the nature of the provider. So if the provider is a covered entity and providing the data elements that would make up a limited data set, then anyone can receive a limited data set. We have a couple other questions that have been coming in about when the fully identifiable attachment 2 will be released for use. And another question that points out that there were versions of those that were circulated in December, so quite some time ago, for feedback. And as one might suspect, when you get into fully identifiable information, and by that we mean, PHI that is more than a limited data set. So, you couldn't just share it under a DUA as a limited data set. Personally identifiable information or identifiable information about a person under the common rule, or education records under FERPA. And we got a lot of feedback on those attachments, on a lot of questions. So we're really trying to be very careful about designing those and incorporating all of the feedback that we received. And we also identified a need to have some FAQs that go along with that. And we didn't want to release those attachments without the FAQs to answer some of the questions and answer, in particular, why we made certain decisions the way that we did. And so we're hoping that those will be published and released in the next couple months. So unfortunately, about a year after we last asked for feedback, but we really want to make sure that we try to get those as right as possible. And Martha will cover this when we get into the rules of the pilot, but because those aren't published yet and because there's a high sensitivity around those, arguably riskier types of data to share, they won't be included in the pilot. So we have a question too to clarify use of the term collaborator in attachment 3. And part of that question is this intended to be data collected under a federal grant or contract? And not necessarily. So the template is designed to be agnostic to the funding source that generated the data set. So we're anticipating that this might end up being used for a lot of data sets that were generated under federal funding because those sponsors are the ones that are requiring data sharing. But if you collected a data set under institutional funds, as long as you have the permission and authority to share the data set and there aren't awkward third-party terms that attach to the data set, you could use the DTUA, or our intention is the DTUA could be used to share that data set. The template isn't well designed for collaborations between the provider and the recipient. I think if that might be something that we look to do in addition to a bidirectional flow of information. So often you'll have, hey, I'll share this data set with you, you share that data set with me, and we'll collaborate on a project. But that is future iterations of template components that we might be able to address that kind of a circumstance. The term collaborator in attachment 3 is then intended to cover perhaps if folks are accustomed to dbGaP requests, where dbGaP says if you're collaborating across institutions, your collaborator at that other institution needs to have their own DUA. So if you're, someone from Harvard Medical School is working with someone at Brigham and Women's Hospital, because we're separate legal entities, that person over at Brigham and Women's Hospital, they need to have their own, well, they call it a data use certification. But we have some data providers who say, yeah, I want to have one agreement with one institution, and if you have a collaborator at another institution that you need to share it with, that's fine, you take care of that. And in the event that a provider wants to permit that, so wants to permit one agreement with Harvard Medical School, knowing that we're going to share it with our collaborator at Brigham and Women's Hospital, that could be recorded in attachment 3. That's the intent there. Maybe we'll take this one more question and then move on to the pilot section of the webinar. Is there a need to add certificate of confidentiality language that is applicable to data produced from NIH grants to comply with the new NIH policy? And that is one of the other common questions we get to is, what about GDPR? Do we have to incorporate something from GDPR? And certainly on our list of things to consider about future iterations of the template, much like the subaward agreement template goes through revisions periodically, but we wanted to test what we have now, and so that we can be collecting information like that on things that we need to add as options. So Martha, I'll pass this over to you so that you can take us through the pilot.
Great. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So as Melissa mentioned, the DTUA working group created the templates for the transfer and sharing of research data from provider institutions to the recipient institutions for use in a research project at the recipient institutions. So it is going from the provider to the recipient. And the purpose of the pilot is to collect data that will help the working group ascertain if the templates create greater consistency in terms of format to reduce associated administrative burden. So are the templates working? And the pilot is expected to have approximately 30 member institutions, and from their experience, we are hoping to get feedback as to whether the templates succeed in providing this low burden method for sharing non-publicly available data. If it is evident that some of the terms should be changed, the pilot will enable us to know which terms should be revisited. The aim is to gather information that will result in confirming or highlighting the necessary changes if needed. And how are we going to collect this data? So, sorry. Okay, so we're going to be collecting data in 3 different ways. First, we will collect the quantitative metrics using a form, like an Excel spreadsheet, that will be provided to the participants and will require data submission on a quarterly basis by the participants. In addition, we're also looking for more detailed information on 1 to 3 DTUAs per month. And we will have an online questionnaire that the participants will be able to complete and submit to us. And then finally, we will also seek feedback from the participants on their experiences in general and on the template usability via 2 surveys, one at the halfway point and one at the completion of the pilot. For the metrics, we'll be collecting the data that's listed on this slide. And we were somewhat limited to what the participating institutions collect themselves and what their systems can supply back to us. So again, since the templates are intended for use when there is data flowing in a single direction from the provider to the recipient, the spreadsheet is set up that way. Let's see. We are planning to distribute the spreadsheet to the participants and also upload it to the FTP Data Stewardship website. The data is going to show us how often the templates are used, the type of entity receiving the DTUA, how long it takes the agreements to be executed, and the data type. And it allows for comments too. Then the qualitative questionnaire will be collected in the form of this online questionnaire, and it will ask questions about specific incidences of using the DTUA. It'll include whether the standard terms were sufficient or whether they needed to be modified, and whether the templates were used or whether the templates were used but and modified and the FDP moniker was removed. access to the online questionnaire will be made available to non-participants too. So we encourage everyone to use these and also to provide feedback. Let's see. So what is required of the pilot participants? So the participants will be expected to use the template for standalone DTAs only when the pilot participant is the provider, as I mentioned, and the data type, as Melissa mentioned, is either de-identified or a limited data set. The use of the template should be a starting point in order to participate in the pilot. We will collect data on the modifications required in these examples. So we're hoping that the providers and the recipients will encourage people to use the templates if they're presented with something else where the templates have been applicable. We will provide pushback language to the participants to use if other institutions are not using the templates. This chart on the slide here shows when the template should be used. It's available on the Data Stewardship website, and it's also available in the FAQs and will be supplied to the participants. So if people can read this carefully, it's a pretty good summary of when they're applicable. Participants will also be asked to sign a participation agreement, and I'll talk about that further in a little bit. And so the start date is November 1st. The term of the pilot is expected to be 12 months. However, we do reserve the right to extend it if we have to collect more data, if we don't have enough data. And some institutions may not be able to join right now, but please do let us know if you're interested, and we'll reassess at the 6-month mark if there's sufficient interest to add more participants. The updates will be shared at the FTP meetings and through the listserv and through emails. FTP members can sign up for the pilot listserv. Is that correct, Melissa?
We will have a listserv, yes, for pilot participants only. So the institutions that are formally participating in the pilot will have a listserv. And then there is a link available via the FDP website for anyone who would like to sign up for the data stewardship or contracts listservs. But the pilot listserv will be closed to formal pilot participants.
Okay. But we will be putting information on those other listservs as well. So in terms of the participation agreement, it will include the participants' agreement to use the template when appropriate, to complete the metrics data collection sheet and return it quarterly, to complete the online questionnaire for 1 to 3 D2As per month, and to complete the semi-annual online survey. They will also agree to provide their institution contact information and a consent to the institution's name being included in public listings of participant institutions. The agreements are due back October 29th. There are a number of resources that are available for everyone, and they actually are quite helpful. There's the glossary that defines the terms in the DTUA templates, the guidance chart, which I showed you, and there's also a tool for classifying human subject data, which is very helpful. And then the FAQs answer a lot of questions that people may have. This webinar will be posted on the website, and we also are providing a DTUA 101 and pilot slide deck, so this slide deck, and so that folks can use that to share at their own institutions. And then I guess so. I could take some questions about the pilot if anybody has any.
Yeah, I think we also have time for if folks have other questions that they'd like to ask about the templates as well. But I did just want to make one comment on the participation agreement in case there's anyone who is signed up, excuse me, to participate and is thinking, I don't have an agreement to return on the 29th. We're just waiting for final approval from the FTP Executive Committee of that agreement, and then we'll be sending it out to the folks that we have that either reached out to us to express that their institution was interested in participating or whose name we got as the authorized official for one of those institutions. So those will be coming soon. And I also wanted to maybe say a few words about the use of name permission. I know that a lot of institutions are very sensitive about how their name is used, or maybe I'm biased that way because Harvard is very sensitive about the way its name is used. And just want to make it clear that we've had a lot of questions from institutions asking if we could please publish a list of who's participating, so that institutions know if I want to use the FTP DTUA template, who's likely to accept it, and also a little bit of safety in numbers. An institution may be more able to get buy-in from the folks that need to provide approval if they can see a list of the other institutions that have agreed to participate in the pilot or have agreed to use the template. So, but we would be very clear that it's not an endorsement. It's just a list of names of institutions who've agreed to participate.
So I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Actually, here's one.
So, Martha, I have one question.
Okay.
If an institution isn't going to participate in the pilot, can they still use the template?
Absolutely, yes. And however, if they're going to make any changes to it, we ask that the FTP moniker be removed. And so here we have a question. Is it the case then that only pilot participants can use the agreement for now, and can you publish the list of those institutions participating in the pilot? So I think we already answered that.
Yeah. As soon as I know that everyone who's participating has given me permission to do that, I will be posting a list so that folks know. How about if we have institutions that are a little bit on the fence right now, or might be right now working on their roles and responsibilities for DUAs or putting in place some policies. Can they be added to the pilot later?
Well, we're going to reassess in 6 months to see if they can be added. For the short term, well, they should let us know now just in case, because we don't know what the response is going to be with the agreements coming back. Hopefully they'll all come back and signed. But if people can let us know now if they're interested, but if they can't join till later, the answer is it depends how things look in 6 months.
So we have one more question here. Will each institution have a main point of contact that we can work with on issues, or should we work with the pilot leaders first? Well,
that's an interesting question. I would say if it's regarding the specific data transfer, they should be talking with the contacts at the institution. If there's sort of a general question, then I think you and I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah,
about the pilot.
Yeah, much like institutions who might have participated in the expanded clearinghouse will have experienced, sometimes change management is hard, and it takes a little while for information about new initiatives or pilot initiatives to make it to all the appropriate folks. So we will be asking institutions to designate a main point of contact, and we would like to, in addition to the list of participating institutions, at least for the other pilot institutions, post who the main point of contact is for that institution, so that if there are issues, you can try to work directly with that institution themselves. We also are going to be posting sample pushback language, much like with the expanded clearinghouse. If you are expecting to be receiving the FDP D2A pilot template from another pilot institution, some sample language that you can use as a starting point for saying, did you know that you're part of the pilot, and could we please use this template? But, Martha and I are always happy to help out with general questions about how it should work, or the rules of the pilot, or, reach out in the event that there's some confusion about participation. We have another question here. Will pilot institutions be required to use the FDP D2A template? And Martha, if you want to pull back up the chart, maybe, I think it's slide 15. So you can see in this chart, there's only one use case where we've said that use is required, and that's when the pilot participant is the provider. The other party is an FDP member institution or other domestic low-risk nonprofit, and the data type is de-identified or a limited data set. And in those circumstances, we're saying that from pilot institutions, use of the template is required. And the reason we've designed it that way is that we acknowledge that the templates might not work for a tiny NGO that you're sharing data with, or a company. And also because when you are the recipient of data, you have less control over the agreement template that gets used. It's often the provider of a data set that might decide which agreement gets used. And in other cases, we've said, we encourage use, or, we ask that if you're the recipient in that same set of circumstances, could you ask the other institution if they'd be willing to use the template? But other than in that circumstance, it's not required. One more question here. For the pilot, would we report agreements where we don't use the FDP template because it is a two-way transfer? Template is just for one-way transfer. Oh, I see. So if you've got a DUA that's bidirectional flow, would we ask for that to be included in the spreadsheet?
And I don't think so, right? Actually, I'm not sure the answer to that.
Yeah. That is a good question and a good one for us to make sure we have on the instructions for the spreadsheet, but I'm going to say no. Excuse me, and the reason is that it's too different. It's sort of like we wouldn't ask for a collaboration agreement that happens to include data sharing terms to be reported on the spreadsheet. So if you really want to, but I think our cleanest data will be looking at the unidirectional transfer using the FDP template or using a different template. But I'll make note of that for our instructions. I think that's a good question.
Yeah. So it looks like there are no more questions. So I think if anybody has any questions, they should feel free to contact Melissa or myself. And Melissa, do you have any sort of final comments?
Just to say that the next step to formally sign up will be that Martha and I will be sending out the agreement to the institutions interested in participating and asking for that to be returned. And then making sure that all of the resources that we've talked about today are posted on the website, in addition to the recording of the webinar. We'll also make sure that we've posted these slides in the event that a participating institution or another institution wants to do a presentation on the template or the pilot for stakeholders within their institution, that you could feel free to take these slides and modify as necessary for your internal community. And as Martha said, we're very happy to take any questions, in particular questions about how the metrics reporting tools work, or FAQs or content that we're missing from the pilot FAQs. Any questions that folks have about the final rollout. All right. Like Martha said, it looks like we don't have any other questions. And if you do, Martha and my contact information is on the final slide. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for joining us.